today we have our very own Michelle Jordan. For those of you who don't know Michelle, which I don't think most of you do, Michelle is appointed between SCAS and the Fulton, what is it, Education College or what, I can't remember those things. And she applies, Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College, thank you. And so she applies complex systems methodology and ideas to the very important area of how students learn, how one should organize environments that are conducive for learning. I think this is an absolutely essential application of complex adaptive systems thinking. And so without further ado, I cede the floor to Michelle.
Thank you so much, Manfred. I'm going to very quickly see if I can get this set up right. If I do this, do you see my presenter view? Or
yes,
okay, darn.
we do.
Yeah, I don't want that.
You just have to do play or play from start. That works.
Well, I'll just play from start and I'll do the best I can with my notes. Right. Okay, let me also start my video. Okay, thank you for your patience, everyone. All right, in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and get started. So collaborative group work is something that I've been interested in my entire career. I started off my life as an elementary school music teacher and was very interested in how youth did creative composing together. So I did a lot of composing. Someone will have to help me with the chat if there's something I need to know. So I did a lot of composing with my students and tried to really got interested in the interactions that they had as they tried to work together in these open-ended learning environments to create something together. So to create what I would call an emergent creative product. So a lot of researchers are interested in this and interested in improving the socio-interactional dynamics of learning in small groups. So that's what I'm going to be exploring through part of this talk. I want to acknowledge three of my co-authors who have been really influential, particularly in my thinking about complexity and particularly in applying complexity to small groups. Ruben McDaniel, who was a professor of organizational management theory and particularly for healthcare organizations and healthcare teams. Bernard Rica, who is a physicist and also a nonlinearist, as he would call himself. And Nicole Bowers, who is a recent graduate from the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College LLT program. And who has been working with me, and we've been doing some exploration of groups of complex systems across multiple scales, and looking at a little bit of social network analysis in that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just some background research on complexity in education more generally, and then begin looking at collaborative learning groups as complex adaptive systems, and then talk a bit about how me and some of my colleagues have been looking at seeking self-organization in small learning groups. I want to quickly mention that the CCS just yesterday had a sub-satellite conference on complex systems in education that they've been having for a while now. This is a day-long session in which educational scholars are coming around to discuss things like hierarchical relationships between systems, and their constituent components, for example, students within classrooms, within school buildings, complex transformations such as second order change in the qualitative transitions in children's intellectual development, and emergent learning processes, which is a thing that I'm also very interested in. Educational interest in educational research from a complex systems perspective really can be traced back to the New England Complex Systems Institute's think tank in 1999, where a set of educational researchers working also with Yanir Bar-Yam came together and identified two roles for complexity in education. One was learning about complex systems, which we at that time knew very little about. And then the second was learning in complex systems, which we also knew very little about at that time. So they were interested in how both of these roles could inform the process of educational change and improvement across grade levels, starting from pre-K all the way through undergraduate education. So educational and learning sciences research related to learning about complex systems has focused on two things. One, how do novices think about complex systems, and how do they come to have more expert intuitions about them? And then how might we design learning environments and create educational resources and materials to foster intuitions and tune learners' intuitions about complex systems? And of course, these two streams of research have very permeable boundaries. An early wave that started around the beginning of this century compared expert and novice understandings, identifying misconceptions about complex systems. For instance, a strong tendency to impose centralized control when none exists, slippages between individual and aggregate levels, studied often, for instance, in difficulties understanding electricity, and robust misconceptions about emergent processes. So Mickey Chi, for instance, and her colleagues have done a lot of work looking at the ways that learners frequently mistake emergent processes for direct or sequential processes. So they contend that students have difficulties learning about complex systems because the relationships at different levels are not intuitively obvious. And those characteristics present cognitive barriers that make those complex systems difficult to understand. So people have a natural tendency to mischaracterize complex system processes, and they don't understand collective causes. For instance, emergent processes that self-arise from interactions without centralized control. Sorry, flipping. Hamelo Silver and Pfeffer and their colleagues have also studied the students' misconceptions about systems, or perhaps more, it's better to say their lack of conceptions. They've used structure behaviors functions theory to look at how novices and experts think differently about complex systems, and then to try to design environments that will help novices take up more sophisticated understandings and be able to observe and explain systems in more sophisticated ways. Joshua Danish and his colleagues have also looked at structure, behaviors, and functions theory to support learners, and in their case, looking at very young learners, first graders, kindergartners, and they've gone on to show that third-person perspectives, for instance, using agent-based modeling, can be more efficacious for learning about complex systems than first-person perspectives, even for these young learners. Of course, all of this work owes a great deal to earlier pioneers who are building learning environments to tune young people's intuitions about complex systems, such as Papert, Resnick, and Stevens Colella. So a bit more germane to my work is research on learning in complex systems. So researchers interested in this area have explored complex systems as a way of theoretically grounding educational processes. Work, for instance, by Bill Dahl, Brent Davis, Dennis Samara, Deborah Osberg, and others represent early research theorizing curriculum, schools, classrooms, and collaborative learning groups as complex systems. I've spent a bit of time thinking and writing about the fact that students will live and work in complex adaptive systems for their entire lives. They're ubiquitous. And therefore, students need to see complex adaptive systems as an ordinary part of life where extraordinary things can emerge. So McDaniel and I, along with other scholars, have argued that scientific determinism's influence on the pursuit of efficiency, and system perfection in the social professions influenced the development of schools as places to prepare students for a life in which their challenge was to learn to participate in a finished and stable universe. But if we're going to have complexity literate students, then we need to provide opportunities for complex systems learning across curriculum disciplines and to develop complexity informed scopes and sequences. So the development of complexity, scope, and sequence is not something that I've spent a lot of time on. Likely the educational scholar who's come closest to that at this point in time is Nikki Chi and her colleagues. But I do think that in addition to computational thinking, which we've often talked about in the SCAS group, there are some other learning opportunities and needs that common characteristics of complex systems and a comprehensive understanding of complex systems suggests that students might need to learn if we're going to take complexity seriously. So in essence, we suggest that two capacities are needed: the ability to live with uncertainty comfortably and the ability to participate in dynamic relationships fully. So children need to recognize, for instance, that their inability to predict the future and their parents and their teachers' inability to predict the future springs in part from the nature of the world. Because we live in a creative world that's still unfolding, we're likely to experience uncertainty frequently. So thinking both computational uncertainty, environmental uncertainty, and what we might call psychological uncertainty. We need to come to learn to expect those things. They need to recognize the difference between uncertainty stemming from cognitive limitations and uncertainty stemming from complexity, and that different strategies might be needed to cope with the different forms of uncertainty. So I believe that both of these things can be fostered through more attention to well-designed experiences in collaborative learning groups. So I am getting there. So my understandings of complex adaptive systems and their ubiquity in the natural and the social systems in which we live and of which we are a part lead me to urge more attention to opportunities for these kinds of activities in the design of teaching learning environments: collective sense-making, improvisation, learning to navigate uncertainty, real work with real consequences, where tasks are likely to be more complex, more novel, have more unfamiliar concepts and practices. And then particularly more opportunities for self-organization and collaborative learning groups. So it is these understandings that have led to my deep interest in collaborative learning groups, and particularly groups formed around semi-open structured tasks, what educational scholars often call ill-structured tasks, such as project-based learning, open-ended classroom discussions in small groups, collaborative inquiry, and something that I've spent a lot of time looking at, engineering design teams. And I'm talking about engineering design teams in elementary, middle, and high schools. It seems to me that such groups offer the most potential for educational experiences that help students develop the capacities for learning to live with uncertainty and for participating in dynamic relationships. So I posit that collaborative problem-solving groups are complex systems, and I'm not alone among educational scholars in doing this. In offering complex systems theory as a framework for theorizing about the functioning of collaborative groups in educational settings. From a complex systems perspective, intergroup or interactions can be considered processes of individuals learning from the group, and also as the group collectively learning through the recursive patterns of interaction among the group members. So group level phenomenon emerge from the myriad of moment-by-moment interactions of the individuals coordinating their learning activity around a particular task. So as they have an intention around a particular task in a particular learning context. So examples of this kind of emergence that are pertinent to my work are topical threads emerging from the agent level interactions of students, threads that arise during the conversation, and then perhaps transitions between the iterative phases of collaborative engineering problem-solving activity. And then simultaneously, the emergent properties of a group enable and constrain further individual level processes, what can be said and what can be done by any individual at any particular time. Okay, so in terms of collaborative group learning, I'm interested in theoretical understandings. So how can we study things at the group level, not just how students learn in a group, which is what a lot of the research has been on up until very recently, but also what the group itself is doing. And then can we and should we treat groups as complex adaptive systems? Can they be self-organizing? And if so, what does that tell us about how we should design learning activities? What's the appropriate level of scaffolding, for instance, for collaborative groups? How much structure should we build in? What aspects of a task should be structured and what should be left productively unstructured? Are questions that I'm interested in. And then methodologically, how can we observe and explain self-organization in collaborative learning groups? My work has been done in open-ended task structures. Kimberly et al. Cautioned that most collaborative groups, they would say most, I'm not quite so sure, they would say most collaborative learning groups don't exhibit self-organization that typifies the nonlinear dynamics of complex systems, because a lot of the tasks in classrooms are just too prescriptive. The norms are too rigid for interaction, and the instruction is too teacher-led. Stanislavskis, in turn, theorized that self-organization and emergence in patterns of classroom discourse could arise in groups where tasks are novel to the students, the problems are open-ended, solutions inductive, and the setting is sufficiently unstructured to allow students the freedom to establish their own iterative and recursive interactional processes. So in order for self-organization to lead to emergent patterns in a group, these are the conditions that need to be met. So I have studied these kinds of situations for a while now. So there are a few researchers who are explicitly theorizing complex collaborative groups as complex systems in order to guide empirical work. And those that do, many of them use qualitative analysis to investigate supposed nonlinear interactions and emergent in collaborative interactions that are taking place at different organizational levels and temporal scales. And this is definitely how I've done a lot of my work. So I first started seeking self-organization by examining the discourse of collaborative learning groups in online learning, open-ended discussions of course readings in university courses, such as educational psychology courses. So we adapted a model by Davis and Samara, arguing that in order for emergence to occur in a self-organizing learning system, you need internal redundancy and diversity, coherence and randomness, decentralized control, and neighbor interactions. And we believe that those kinds, those are available in open-ended classroom discussion. So we applied complex systems theory to explain observed differences in patterns of interaction and sudden shifts of those patterns in the online discussion groups in a college course. One of the things we wrestled with, and that frankly I still wrestle with, is how to characterize the system when you're talking about a discursive system. And especially in terms of what are the entities or agents that are self-organizing. So we can think of the individuals as the agents that are self-organizing in a classroom discourse system, but those agents are really interacting with the types of talk turns that are made, and those types of talk turns can be made by different individuals in the group. So are we looking at systems of is it most fruitful to look at systems of individuals, or is it more fruitful to look at systems of types of discursive moves that are being made? This is a wrestle for me. At any rate, we took discussion topics and discursive threads of topics as emergent structures with qualitative properties. So for instance, different spans, different branching, and argue that they're not reducible to the properties of the online messages being posted by the students at the lower levels of the system. And then that these then reach back down to constrain the range of comments that it's possible for any participant to make at any particular time. In another qualitative study, my co-authors and I attempted a systems level understanding of interactional problems in collaborative learning. So we used a complex systems framework to analyze unproductive interactional dynamics in a case study of one collaborative learning group of fifth graders who were engaged in an engineering design challenge over multiple class sessions. So educational scholars draw from a wide range of perspectives to examine learning as a form of social activity. And so in this paper, we put complex systems theory into conversation with a theory that's more commonly used in educational research, situative cognition, in order to try to get some deeper understanding of this case, and to help us resolve systems of social activity in ways that characterize learning processes as more than the sum of individual learners, which both theoretical frameworks are interested in doing. So for today, we applied both of those theories to this perplexing case, the case that perplexed us. This team's persistently unproductive social activity during a 14-session collaborative project in which members of the focal student team and their teacher repeatedly attempted to remediate what they all agreed were unproductive patterns of activity that developed among the group members as they developed a remote-controlled paddle-propelled robot. So this is not an unusual case. These are things that we run into all the time in collaborative learning because groups both succeed and fail to get things done. In this case, create a robot to clean a lake pollution, and then also to learn things, to understand how things work and finding things out. So we take that we take the position that collective learning at the group level can be seen as the recursive patterns of interaction among group members, because complexity accounts for moment-to-moment interactions that give rise to group level dynamics that are more than the sum of their parts. For example, we characterized attractor patterns. So recognizable, what we defined as recognizable patterns of social activity around which participation tended to evolve in this group, in order to examine how the interactional system level patterns can emerge and transform over time out of the coordinated actions of individuals engaged in learning activity. So we were interested in how complexity can illuminate how individuals are subject to constraints on their agency via their membership in collaborative groups, and also to help exculpate how those constraints come about in the first place. So analysis of attractor patterns illuminate emergent system level phenomenon much over time, such as collaboration or lack of collaboration. So we took a qualitative approach to mapping phase shifts, and across the 14 sessions of this group's activity, we mapped their patterns of interactions as well as the transitions among those patterns in order to characterize 4 attractive patterns that we identified: collaboration, which is where the group started; orienting to the leader; power struggles; and then being disengaged. So the figure on the slide represents these attractor patterns and uses numbers to order them as they emerged. The first letter of each group member's name characterizes their typical contributions to the pattern. And then the area of each circle is meant to communicate the relative dominance of each pattern over the time span of the group. And then the directional arrows denote the common transitions among those attractors and the group's trajectories. So interactional patterns quickly formed that moved away from the group away from the initial collaborative interaction. And as a result, they spent little time in this pattern. Rather, the larger areas for orienting to the leader and power struggles became the place where the group spent most of its time, and they continue to shift between those 2 attractive patterns. This is an example that I think I will just move on from, of the attractor pattern of orienting to the leader. And one of the things that we think is fairly interesting is that this attractor pattern persisted even when the oriented to leader in the group changed. We become very, very dominant and pretty intractable, which is one of the perplexing things about it, even though everyone agreed that they would like to interrupt it. So as complexity would suggest, it might be difficult to interrupt such very strong attractors. I think I'm going to go ahead and move on. So I've also engaged in quantitative and computational work with another set of scholarly collaborators, Bernard Rika and Nicole Bowers. And this work arose from our collective interest in collaborative learning as a social level phenomenon, and particularly in interactions that occur during and that comprise complex problem solving. It also arose from our mutual dissatisfaction with current approaches to examining interactions in collaborative learning groups. So a lot of traditional methods of analyzing group discourse are not sufficient to understand complex group dynamics, and we don't claim that we have the the solution to that we've arrived anywhere, but this is what we're trying to come to. So some of the limitations are that a lot of analysis that's been done takes the conversational turn as the unit of analysis, is focused on individual student analysis, and focuses on identifying the content of interactions, and doesn't go on to try to get at the dynamics. That's not there is work in this area, but in large measure, this is where the field is, and is recognized it, and is really trying to persist in developing this area. And we're doing that through a complex systems perspective. So often in practice, we go back to that practicable question, measures of group functioning are subjective and idiosyncratic. So we'd like to see if we can do move that a bit more. So we're interested in this line of research in the questions of, can we treat collaborative learning groups as self-organized complex systems with emergent group level properties? So we are exploring methods for operationalizing emergence in groups in order to further theories of group interactions. So we've examined group discourse as a dynamic network, taking the students to be the nodes of the network and the utterances of the turns as the edges. Okay, so we're trying to move beyond simple temporal dynamics in order to augment what we already currently understand about collaborative learning groups and their dynamics. So thus far, we have done some exploration of using three methods: temporal analysis, burstiness, and power law distribution, looking at power law distributions. So these are all very new to us, and they were in the exploratory phases with all of them. I also want to acknowledge that Barney Rika is our statistician and computational expert. So I will be hand wavy about some of this, as that's not something I am still working on. The context for all of this work is an engineering design project that took place in a regular fifth grade class near the end of the school year. The task was for the students in working in teams of 4 students each to find an environmental problem in their community and to design a robot to address that, and to design it and build and program the robot. So these work sessions took place over 14 days across about a month's worth of time. So we used qualitative methods first to code the collaborative discourse, and computational methods to examine the coded discourse of 3 collaborative teams. I want to note that the problem-solving context of this study was a free interaction process, which was purposefully selected because emergent patterns are more likely in settings in which role taking is unstructured. So this is why we chose a very open-ended process where the teacher left the students largely to determine the pace through which they would work through the engineering design cycle in their own time. Our assumption was that these small collaborative groups were complex systems, so we took the students to be the agents of the systems. We looked at our system of interest was the team of 4 interacting students, while recognizing that they were embedded in this open-ended their interaction was embedded in this open-ended design task, and multiple systems layers were influencing those interactions, including the fact that they were going to be presenting their robot at a school fair at the end of the school year. So we make a claim that the group's engagement in phases of the engineering design cycle, that engagement emerged from the interactions of the individual talk turns. So in essence, the phases themselves were emergent properties that emerged out of the cognitively coded talk turns. So often representations of collaborative problem solving, inquiry processes, or the engineering design processes are mistaken as being intentional processes that have to be imposed by a teacher or directed by a group leader. But in fact, if you look at the research, the engineering design cycle is something that, for instance, that has been that has come out of research that through the observation of engineering activity, and is quite likely emergent in these cases as well. So we argue that transitions between problem-solving phases in these groups arise spontaneously from the moment-to-moment self-organized interactions as group members propose ideas, respond to peers' questions, engage in conversation with materials. We theorize that even within the group, there are multiple levels. We can think about multiple levels, starting with speakers, and that each of these levels, a micro level, meso level, and a macro level, can require different units of analysis, different approach to analysis, and a different framework for thinking about collaborative interaction, because they have a different complex character. So we actually focus on three levels in our work at this moment, although we're certainly interested in all of them. So we are interested in the speaker talk turns. So what is actually happening in the turns? Also, the repeating patterns of talk turns, types of talk turns, which we call cognitive types of interaction that are going on. And we think that these patterns are emergent. We would go one step further with the emergent phases of the engineering design cycle and hypothesize that these are causally emergent, which we can talk more about in one of our 2016 paper. So the data, recognizing that I'm losing time here, the data for our studies to date have been taken from 12 class sessions, 36 transcripts, a whole lot of utterances in terms of a classroom data set. And we have recorded the date what we've got is an initial Excel spreadsheet where we've logged all the talk turns that take place in each of the three groups. We've got the date, the group, the speaker, and what we call the cognition code, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then the engineering design cycle phase that the youth were in as they were engaging as the turn was spoken. So at the individual level, of speaker talk turns, we chose a coding scheme following Fior et al. To indicate collaboration moves in collaborative interaction. Fior et al. Used these to look at paired interactions. We, of course, have 4 team members. So this is an attempt to consider the different kinds of cognitive processes that are occurring within a group. And this seemed a coding scheme that was amenable to a dynamic interpretation, as indeed Fior et al. Have used it as well. So, so we assign talk turns to qualitative category, applying this a priori theory-driven codes. And then essentially, we analyzed those codes looking for patterns in the data that repeat, and we note that individual patterns of repeating talk turns aren't yet dynamics. We are moving that direction. We compared those patterns to random data with some of the distributions of codes, with some of the same distributions of codes. And then we compared those patterns across groups, across time, and across speakers. And we want to note with this issue of what is being interacted with. Is it speakers? Is it talk turns? This is something that's really, really challenging to think about. So we compared the sequence of talk turns to a random sequence of talk turns with the same probability distribution. We then demonstrated qualitative differences in talk turns during the different engineering design cycle phases by comparing the frequencies and the patterns of talk turns during different engineering design phases. Okay. So, and we also compared those frequencies and patterns across groups to explore the qualitative differences between the groups. So we see that the transcripts, there are distributions of patterns that aren't random, and in fact, some of them are quite long, which suggests that there are some good links, good interaction, lengthy interaction going on among these youth. Some of them, although, are off task. We then looked at phase changes using entropy. So entropy is a useful tool because entropy increases and reaches a maximum as a system goes through a transition from one phase to another. And we drew on Wiltshire et al. In using entropy to detect changes in the time sequence behavior of those cognition codes of the groups over time, which is represented at the solid line at the top. And then we also looked at that entropy and related it to the engineering design processes phase. So this is a group that this is a representation of a group. Actually, the group that was struggling from our other study, and their interactional dynamics across a single day. So from this graph, several things are apparent. Entropy exhibits a number of local maxima across this time period, and the engineering design cycle phases change over time as well. The entropies derived from individual level utterances, and the engineering design phases were coded at a larger macro level from according to the group focus at each utterance time. So we're looking at two levels, individual group, which is the first requirement for emergence, that there's activity at two or more levels. And then comparing the distribution of frequencies in one sequence to the following sequence yields significant differences in each case. So the phases mark identifiable transitions in the cognition code sequences at the level of the individual turns. And you can also see that many of the local maxima in the entropy are followed by a change in the engineering design process phase, and that a lot of the phases in the engineering design cycle phases are preceded by local entropy maxima. So it's not an exact temporal match, but this lend support to the idea that the engineering design phase is emergent from the individual's interaction. The change at one level, the individual level, corresponds to the change at the group level. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can get just a little bit farther here. So what we see essentially is something that's mostly descriptive rather than dynamic. Like I said, understanding dynamic patterns and conversational patterns among not just pairs, but for interactants is a challenging issue. There are definite differences between the groups. And there are at least some weak correlations between the moving summaries of the types of talk turns and the phases of engineering design process. So in further exploration, we are currently using measures of burstiness and power law distributions to think about how groups may be self-organizing. So essentially, burstiness is an intermittent increase and decrease in the activity of frequencies of events. We don't see things at nice regular pace in classroom discourse, but instead they're bunched together and then nothing happens for a while, and then they're bunched together again, taking up this same idea of the cognitive types of moves that are being made in these groups. And then sometimes this burstiness is also related to distributions, power law distributions. Sometimes things will have distributions where you'll have an exponential or a Poisson distribution, and where you don't see a lot of burstiness. So if we can think about burstiness as a system having some memory of what's happened. So long-term correlations don't exist in a non-bursty sequence. In terms of, for our data, we looked at, we used event-based burstiness because we didn't have our data coded for time. So we did a event-based burstiness. We did it for each speaker, and we did it also for the types of cognitive talk turns that were going on in the group. So just to give you a really short look at what this looked like. So remembering that bursty coefficients range from -1 to 1, and generally negative numbers mean that there's randomness, there's no discernible pattern, no system memory, and positive numbers show burstiness. The system has memory that is participating in its own organization, that there is evidence of some self-organization. So this first table here is looking at burstiness coefficients for the speaker timing of turns. Is there evidence that speakers at the individual level are self-organizing their interactional contributions to the group? And you can see that overall there is a low amount of burstiness in this group A in terms of their in the timing of individual speakers' turns. The yellow show particularly low burstiness coefficients. The blue is just showing some higher coefficients. And you can see that those differ for the different speakers, but there are some patterns across days where in fact speaker burstiness is fairly shows some commonalities among group members. I won't show you all of those, so that I can show you just a little bit of the burstiness coefficients at the level of those cognitive turns, the type of talk turns that students were making. So we coded for essentially 7 different types of talk turns, cognitive codes, 4 of which we think are task related, moving the task forward, and then 3 of which in the red we see as being about social interactional processing among the group. Part of that processing is off-task behavior, which you can see in group A as quite high burstiness coefficients, interestingly enough. So what if we compare the burstiness, so the self-organization at the individual level of the individual timing of talk turns with this group level analysis of burstiness in terms of types of cognitive turns clustering, then what we see is a lot more burstiness at the individual group level. We also see patterns that I'm not going to be able to get into in terms of different patterns in different groups. And different patterns of burstiness across time. So changes in burstiness across time. I'm not going to be able to get into our power law distributions, but just to say, to say that number one, we just presented these results for the first time at a conference a few days ago. So what our findings right now are, and our interpretations are very speculative. But what we can say is that we detected little to no burstiness, so little to no self-organization at the individual level. In terms of timing of talk turns, we did detect burstiness in the cognitive contribution patterns, some at the individual level, which I did not show you, but a lot, the most burstiness or the most evidence of self-organization at the group level. So it appears that metacognitive tasks are organized, or at least that they allow organization to take place. The fact that we see organization at this group, more organization at the group level, coincides with something that Vygotsky, which is a theorist that we often use in educational research, what he posits, which is that every function in a child's cultural development appears first at the social level, at the level of social interaction, and then later is internalized by the child. And so we hypothesize, this seems to coincide with both our burstiness analysis and our power law analysis. We do see that perhaps what's happening here is that self-organization is occurring at the level of the group and may then be taken up and internalized at the level of self-organization of an individual. We do see more burstiness at the group level across time. We wonder if that means that groups might be becoming healthier over time. But if we think back to the group where we looked at the attractor, those persistent patterns of attractor patterns that seem to us not useful for the learning or the production of the group, that may be a wrong assumption. More organized doesn't necessarily mean healthier. So that's something we are looking into by comparing our qualitative reading of the discourse. We see a general decrease in the shape parameter over time. That has to do with the organizational functioning in terms of the proportion of the distribution of frequencies of either talk turns at the individual level or types of talk turns at the group level. And these are some questions that we are still grappling with. It is 3 minutes till 12. And so I think I will leave it there. And I will stop sharing. And see if we have, I don't know if we have time for a short amount of time for questions, but happy to play.
Right before I have to run to my next meeting, thanks, Michelle. And I hope that somebody can manage the discussion, or you can do it yourself. And great talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Manfred.
You should be able to unmute and ask your own questions.
Well, if I mean, I'll go ahead and step in if there aren't any. Oh, there's a question in the chat, maybe. Eric, do you want to go ahead and just speak that up? Or maybe he can't. I don't see him on here. So Eric Johnston. Oh, he had to leave. Okay, he just said I saw multiple people. I saw connections they did not know. Okay, appreciated the talk.
I'll talk then if you have a second. Michelle, I love that. I loved your talk. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that figure that showed entropy versus the transitions in different tasks in the group. And if you think that might be applicable to system transitions more generally, or your thoughts on it at least. And you're muted.
Thank you, Shade. So I have to admit that my understanding of how the functions for entropy are growing but small, but I'll do my best. So essentially, we looked at transitions between two different things, right? The phases of, we use a moving window entropy to think about the transition from phases of different types of interactional talk terms. And then also looked at, compared the movement of those phase changes with those larger, more macro level tasks, structures that were going on that were that the task was so dependent on, which were engagement in the engineering design phases. So number one, there's a lot of noise in the system, right? So it's a bit tricky to say too much, but we do think that it's potentially useful that these phase changes at the local level are related to phase changes at a more macro level, in terms of trying to help teachers and students think about how they might organize what they might pay attention to in their interactional turns if you want to support a more product oriented, when we take product to be learning and we take product to be their engineering design task, the individual robot. Then we think there may be some handholds there, but frankly, Shade, we're pretty far from being able to say what those might be. We've gone back in and we've tried to look more closely at some of those phase changes, particularly at the entropy line, to understand their interaction with the engineering design phase. And sometimes what we see is very strong, a very strong qualitative match. And sometimes what we see is other things going on. For instance, some of those power struggles that we didn't code for, but that are still showing up and in the entropy line, and maybe showing up, maybe showing us some of the dynamics of the system, even though we didn't code for them. So they may be able to show us some things that we didn't necessarily think to look for. I think I talked all around your question, Shade.
That's okay. We can talk offline too. I think you have a lot there that could connect to other people's work.
Thank you. I'd love to talk more about that.
Anybody else want to pose a question here?
I'd just like to pose a general question about the tasks. These were engineering tasks, and were they actually building devices that worked or did not work? And did you give any value to the fact, that whether they did work, that is, whether there was final success to their efforts or not?
Yeah. So the tasks were quite complicated in that the students did go all the way through the engineering, all the way through to defining their own problems. So problem scoping. So when we talk problem scoping all the way through to presenting their finished prototypes that they had built and tested and built, programmed and tested, and then presented them to a local audience. So there was a lot of room in these tasks for a lot of different things to happen over the length of this project. So that gives us a lot of room to play with the dynamics in terms of how things might cluster together.
I know it's early in the analysis, but I was wondering if you could connect between the structures or the processes that were developing in the more successful groups, that is, those that produced the best products, the best results. Was there a particular pattern in their behavior?
Well, so tentatively, here's what I think might be true, that the groups who are more self-organizing in a healthy way might show more patterns of burstiness for instance, in some types of talk turns over others. So in this task, I'm hypothesizing that the healthier groups would show more burstiness in evaluating alternatives and generating design ideas, particularly early in the task when when they are problem framing and solution generating. We hypothesize and tentatively think we see more burstiness, more organization, more more system memory early in the off-taskness, and then less burst of healthy groups, and then less burstiness and off-taskiness later. So groups, when they're, in order to become a group, it takes a lot of social interactional trust. And if at the beginning, we would expect that there are clusters of off-task talk that would be actually productive for the group as they try to come to understand one another, feel one another out, get a sense for each other as a team, and create some team cohesion. And that over time, we might see that social interaction, that off-task socialness would become less bursty, more random, if you will, just coming in, as occasion arises, rather than having a real, than serving a real need for cohesion development, as it will in the beginning of a healthy group. And in fact, in our one unhealthy group, we see that off-taskness does, the burstiness of coefficients of off-taskness remain high for those groups, for that group across the task. And tentatively, at the moment, we're interpreting that as the fact that this social interactional gelling, they couldn't make that gel across their interactions, across the time frame of their interactions. Warren, I hope that spoke at least somewhat to your question.
Yes, it does very much. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. If there's no more questions, maybe we give you a chance to have some lunch, Michelle. And thanks for the talk. Really interesting talk, really diverse, lots of things going on in that. So appreciate you taking the time to talk with us on that.